We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
The call came before the family had even filed a formal missing persons report. Not a tip from a stranger. Not a lead from an anonymous source. A 911 call placed by someone who already knew exactly where to look, and exactly what had happened inside the quiet Catalina Foothills home on the night of January 31st. That sealed recording, that single preserved piece of audio, has not been released to the public. And the fact that investigators have refused to let it go, refused to let journalists hear it, refused to let it enter the public conversation, tells you something that no press release ever could. It tells you that what is on that tape changes the entire story. And tonight, the story has changed. Human remains have been located in connection with the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. As of this recording, law enforcement has not officially identified those remains, has not issued a formal statement assigning cause or identity, and has not announced charges. But the architecture of this investigation has shifted in a way that cannot be walked back. When a missing person case produces a body, even an unconfirmed one, the question is no longer where. The question becomes who, and why, and how long they thought they could hide it. Stay with me, because this is where everything we thought we knew about this case begins to crack open. For those who have been following this story, you already know the surface details. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, sharp and independent, living alone in a $1 million property in the Catalina Foothills of Arizona. A woman with no history of wandering, no cognitive decline significant enough to explain a disappearance, no reason to simply vanish on the night she was driven home from a family dinner. She took an Uber to her daughter Annie's house that evening. She did not take an Uber back. Tommaso, Annie's husband, drove her home at approximately 9:50 in the evening. He reportedly watched her walk inside safely. And then, for 14 hours, nobody checked on an 84-year-old woman living alone. No call. No text. No morning knock on the door. 14 hours of silence that ended not with a welfare check from a worried daughter, but with a 911 call that the sheriff's department immediately sealed. Think about that for a moment. Not the 14 hours of silence alone, though that is striking enough. Think about the sequence. An elderly woman is dropped off at night by a family member. Her doorbell camera records movement at 1:47 in the morning. Her pacemaker, a device designed to keep her heart beating and her location logged, disconnects from her paired phone at 2:28 in the morning. Blood is observed on the porch. No forced entry is documented. And the next morning, the call that reports her missing is not from someone who tried to reach her all morning and got no answer. It is a call that investigators chose to seal the moment it came in. That is not routine procedure for a missing elderly woman. That is evidence preservation. And evidence preservation tells you that investigators heard something on that tape that they did not want a defense attorney hearing before they were ready. Now comes the part that resets every assumption about this case. According to reporting that has circulated in investigative journalism circles, and again, this has not been officially confirmed by law enforcement, human remains may have been located in connection with Nancy's disappearance. If that reporting is accurate, the investigation has formally transitioned from a missing person search to a death investigation. And in death investigations involving elderly victims with no signs of forced entry and no documented external threat, law enforcement does not look outward first. They look inward. They look at who had access. They look at who had knowledge of the victim's vulnerabilities. They look at who had something to gain. And that is where the financial thread becomes impossible to ignore. Because reportedly, and this detail has appeared in multiple independent investigative accounts, Annie Guthrie asked her mother for a substantial loan shortly before Nancy disappeared. And Nancy refused. That single word. Refused. In any other context, a mother declining to lend money to her adult daughter is an ordinary family disagreement. It is the kind of thing that creates tension over Sunday dinners and dissolves by the following month. But when you place that refusal inside the specific timeline, it stops being ordinary. It becomes a motive. It becomes the emotional hinge on which everything else turns. Consider what investigators examining financial motive would do with that detail. They would not simply note it and move on. They would pull every financial record connected to Annie and Tommaso's household. Bank statements, loan applications, credit card debt, mortgage payment history, business accounts. Because a refusal is not just a no. A refusal is a signal that something was needed badly enough to ask for. And the size and urgency of that need shapes everything that follows. A casual request for a few $1,000s to cover an unexpected bill does not carry the same psychological weight as a desperate request for 6 figures tied to a foreclosure notice or a collapsing business. Investigators would need to know not just that a request was made, but why. What was the money for? How badly was it needed? And how close to the edge was Annie's household when the word no came back across the table? This is where it gets complicated, and I need you to stay with me carefully. Annie and Tommaso's home, located roughly 4 miles from Nancy's property, is valued significantly lower than Nancy's $1 million house. That gap alone means nothing. Parents often hold more equity than their children. That is not a crime, and it is not evidence of anything on its own. But when you add a reported loan request, a reported refusal, a power of attorney signed 8 months earlier naming Annie as agent over Tommaso's financial and property matters, and a dinner that same night followed by an undocumented ride home and 14 hours of silence, the gap stops being background noise. It becomes context. And in investigative work, context is everything. Let's talk about that power of attorney for a moment, because it deserves its own attention. In May of 2025, 8 months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, a durable power of attorney was signed, formalizing Annie's authority over Tommaso's financial and property decisions. On its own, that is standard estate planning. Families do it every day. But prosecutors examining financial motive do not see documents in isolation. They see documents in sequence. And the sequence here is difficult to dismiss. Financial authority formalized. Loan request reportedly made. Loan request reportedly refused. Final dinner. Undocumented ride home. Silence. Disappearance. If investigators can show that Annie needed money urgently, was denied, had legal authority over assets within her household, and then the only person who could have helped her was gone, that sequence becomes a prosecutorial timeline, not just a family tragedy. Now, one of the questions that investigative reporters and online communities have been circling for weeks is this: if the motive was financial, why stage it as an abduction? Why introduce a masked figure at the doorbell camera? Why use ransom language? Why create the appearance of an outside threat? The answer, if this theory is accurate, is misdirection. Because if an elderly woman disappears and within hours there are reports of a masked figure and ransom demands, investigators spend their first critical hours looking outward. They are chasing an external suspect. They are protecting a crime scene against the wrong threat. They are treating it as a kidnapping rather than something else entirely. And while they are doing that, digital trails cool. Physical evidence settles. Narratives get established. There is also a secondary benefit to staging a kidnapping rather than allowing a death to be discovered immediately, and it is a benefit that is rarely discussed openly. In a kidnapping, the victim is theoretically still alive. There is urgency, but there is also hope. Hope redirects public attention. Hope keeps journalists writing about a rescue operation rather than a crime scene. Hope keeps the family positioned as victims alongside Nancy rather than as potential subjects of scrutiny. And perhaps most critically, hope delays the forensic reckoning. Because the moment a body is confirmed, investigators stop searching and start building. They stop casting a wide net and start focusing their attention inward on the people who had access, motive, and knowledge. Staging a kidnapping narrative, if that is what happened here, was not just misdirection, it was time. Borrowed time. And time, in a death investigation, is the most dangerous commodity a suspect can try to purchase. But misdirection in the modern age is fragile. It is extraordinarily fragile. Because the same technology that makes staging an abduction look convincing also creates a layered record that cannot be erased. Phones log location. They log movement. They log proximity to cell towers even when no calls are made. They log screen activations, step counts, motion sensor readings. Vehicles log ignition cycles, GPS history, door openings, Bluetooth pairing events. If Annie's phone or Tommaso's phone shows movement during the window between 1:47 in the morning, when the camera went dark, and 2:28 in the morning, when the pacemaker disconnected, investigators know. If the Honda CR-V that was held for over 40 days shows soil residue, fiber transfer, or biological material that connects to a location where remains were found, prosecutors have convergence. And convergence is the word that matters in this case. Not suspicion. Not theory. Convergence. The moment when independent pieces of evidence stop being separate data points and start pointing in the same direction at the same time. If you have a theory about what happened that night, if something about this timeline strikes you as wrong, or if you see a detail that has not been discussed enough, drop it in the comments. This case is full of threads that have not been pulled yet, and sometimes the people watching are the ones who see what journalists miss. Let us talk about Nancy herself for a moment, because she has been in danger of becoming a prop in her own story. An 84-year-old woman living alone in a beautiful home in the Arizona foothills. Independent enough to take an Uber to dinner. Trusting enough to let a family member drive her home. She removed her hearing aids at night, as any person her age might, leaving herself without one of the primary ways she would detect an intrusion. Her security camera was not actively monitored. Her alarm system was not connected to an outside service. She had no overnight caregiver. Each of those vulnerabilities, taken alone, is simply the reality of an elderly woman living independently. But taken together, and placed alongside the question of who knew about each of them, who knew she removed her hearing aids, who knew the camera was not monitored, who knew she had no alarm, the picture becomes something more troubling. Because the person who knew all of those details most intimately was not a stranger. It was family. The 40-day hold on Annie's vehicle deserves more attention than it has received in the mainstream conversation around this case. Standard forensic examination of a vehicle in a missing persons case does not take 40 days. A 40-day hold means layered testing. It means investigators were not just looking for the obvious. They were testing soil from the wheel wells and the floor mats. They were analyzing fiber transfers from the cargo area. They were extracting telematics data, the internal computer logs that track every ignition cycle, every speed change, every door opening event. They were pulling Bluetooth pairing records to see what devices connected to that vehicle and when. If the car moved during the critical early morning window on February 1st, and if the route it traveled aligns with a location where remains were later found, that is not circumstantial evidence. That is a timeline. And timelines are what convictions are built on. If you believe this story deserves wider attention, if you think Nancy Guthrie's case is being underreported or that the financial angle is not getting the scrutiny it requires, share this video. Share it with someone who follows true crime, someone who follows investigative journalism, someone who simply believes that elderly victims deserve the same public outrage as any other. You do not have to believe any one theory is true. You just have to believe the questions are worth asking. Subscribe if you want to follow this as it develops, because based on what is being assembled behind the scenes in this investigation, there are more updates coming, and they are going to matter. Now let us address the sealed 911 call one more time, because it is perhaps the most underrated element of this entire case. When a 911 call is sealed in a missing persons investigation, it is almost never a routine decision. Prosecutors and law enforcement seal recordings for specific reasons. They seal them when the content could compromise a witness. They seal them when the content could alert a suspect to what investigators know. They seal them when the recording itself is expected to be entered into evidence at trial, and early release would give a defense team time to prepare a counter-narrative. The fact that this recording remains sealed weeks into the investigation suggests one or more of those conditions apply. And the most troubling possibility, the one that investigators would be most concerned about, is that the person who placed that call said something on the tape that does not match what the evidence shows. Something that was said too early. Something that was volunteered before it should have been known. Something that answered a question nobody had yet asked. In criminal trials, those moments are not small. They are the thread that unravels everything. Consider what it means to know something before you should. If the caller described the state of the porch, or the location of Nancy's hearing aids, or the condition of a door, in a way that preceded an investigator's discovery of those same details, that is not grief speaking. That is knowledge. And knowledge that arrives ahead of its time in a criminal investigation is one of the most powerful forms of evidence a prosecutor can present to a jury. It does not require a confession. It requires only a comparison between what was said and what was later confirmed. If those two things align in a way that defies coincidence, a jury will feel that misalignment in a way that no expert testimony can manufacture. That is why the 911 call stays sealed. Not to protect the investigation in some abstract sense. To protect its evidentiary integrity until the moment it can be heard by 12 people in a courtroom where its full weight can finally land. Here is what we know about financial motive cases, and why this specific type of crime is so difficult to prosecute quickly. Unlike crimes of passion, which leave obvious physical signatures, Crimes rooted in financial calculation are often cold, deliberate, and staged. The perpetrator has had time to think through the plan. They have anticipated some of what investigators will look for. They have constructed a narrative that they believe will hold. What they rarely anticipate fully is the depth of digital forensics. They do not account for pacemaker logs. They do not account for the fact that a phone sitting untouched on a nightstand still registers movement data. They do not account for the fact that a doorbell camera going offline at 1:47 in the morning is itself a data point, because cameras do not go offline randomly, and investigators will ask whose hands were close enough to make that happen. Prosecutors examining this case through the lens of financial motive would be building something that looks less like a dramatic confrontation and more like an accountant spreadsheet. They would have subpoenaed bank records from every institution Annie and Tommaso used. They would have pulled estate planning documents, insurance policies, property deeds, and any power of attorney paperwork connected to Nancy's estate. If Nancy had life insurance, investigators would want to know who the beneficiary was, when the policy was last reviewed, and whether anyone recently inquired about its terms. These are not emotional arguments. They are documented. They are provable. And when you can walk a jury through a paper trail that shows financial desperation colliding with intimate access to a vulnerable victim, you do not need a confession. You need convergence. Let us also consider the psychological dimension of this, not as a way to assign guilt, but as a way to understand how these situations develop. Financial crimes within families rarely begin with a plan to cause harm. They begin with debt. They begin with a mortgage payment that cannot be met, a business obligation coming due, a credit card statement that has grown beyond management. The rationalization comes gradually. She has more than she needs. She does not understand what we are going through. This is temporary. I will pay it back somehow. By the time desperation has compressed the timeline, the emotional distance between a family relationship and a financial calculation has already collapsed. Investigators who study intrafamily financial crimes recognize that pattern because it appears again and again in the case histories. The crime does not begin with malice. It begins with need. But once a refusal transforms that need into resentment, the emotional architecture changes. And when time pressure enters the equation, when foreclosure is imminent, when a debt collector is calling, when public embarrassment or financial collapse is close, decisions accelerate in ways that rational thinking would never sanction. There is something deeply unsettling about the fact that Nancy spent her last confirmed evening at her daughter's dinner table. That whatever conversation happened over that meal, whatever warmth or tension or ordinary family talk filled that night, was followed within hours by something that investigators are now treating as potentially criminal. The Uber she took to get there was documented. The ride home was not. That asymmetry matters. One journey has a timestamp, a driver record, an independent witness. The other journey exists only in the account of the person who provided it. And in a case where the timeline around that ride home may ultimately determine when and how something happened to Nancy Guthrie, the absence of a third-party record is not a minor detail. It is one of the most significant gaps in the entire evidentiary structure. What do you believe happened after Tommaso's car pulled away from Nancy's driveway that night? Do you think Nancy made it inside safely and something happened hours later? Or does the timeline suggest something else entirely? The comments are open, and in cases like this, fresh perspective often sees what exhausted investigators miss. As this investigation moves toward what appears to be a formal identification of remains and possibly a charging decision, the public conversation around Nancy Guthrie's case will intensify. More details will surface. More contradictions will emerge. The sealed 911 call will eventually be released, whether through trial proceedings or investigative reporting. The vehicle forensics will be disclosed. The pacemaker logs will be entered into evidence. And when all of those pieces are visible at the same time, the picture they form will either confirm the financial motive theory that investigators appear to be pursuing, or it will reveal something entirely different, an external threat, an unknown actor, a chain of events that nobody has yet imagined. It is also worth noting that the FBI's continued involvement in this case is not incidental. Federal agencies do not maintain long-term engagement in local missing persons cases without specific jurisdictional or evidentiary justification. Their presence suggests one of several possibilities. It could indicate that digital evidence, particularly evidence crossing state lines or involving encrypted communications, required federal tools to retrieve. It could indicate that financial transactions under investigation involved federally regulated institutions. Or it could indicate simply that the complexity and profile of this case demanded resources that local law enforcement alone could not sustain. Whatever the reason, federal involvement raises the ceiling on this investigation. It means the analysis is deeper, the subpoenas are broader, and the patience for assembling a complete and airtight case is greater than anything a county sheriff's department alone would typically commit to. When federal agencies stay in a case this long, it is because they intend to finish it. But right now, what exists is a structured pattern. A reported loan refusal. A final undocumented ride. A 14-hour silence. A camera that went dark at 1:47 in the morning. A pacemaker that logged its last biological signal at 2:28. Blood on a porch. No forced entry. A vehicle held for 40 days. A 911 call nobody has been allowed to hear. And now reports, still unconfirmed, still subject to forensic verification, that human remains have been found. Each of those pieces, alone, is a thread. Together, they are beginning to look like a rope. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She took an Uber to her daughter's house for dinner. She trusted the people around her. She lived alone in a home she had worked a lifetime to own. She deserved to grow old in it. Whatever the investigation ultimately reveals, whatever charges are filed or not filed, whatever a jury one day decides, none of it returns Nancy to the woman she was before January 31st. None of it gives back the Uber ride she should have taken home. None of it answers the question of what those 14 hours of silence really meant, and whether someone who was supposed to love her knew exactly what was happening inside that house and said nothing. Justice in cases like this does not announce itself. It assembles. Quietly, methodically, piece by piece, across months of forensic analysis and subpoenaed records and digital comparisons that no single news cycle can contain. If investigators are building what the evidence suggests they are building, the moment of formal charges will not feel sudden. It will feel inevitable. It will feel like the conclusion of a case that was never really a mystery, only a secret that the evidence was slowly refusing to keep. And for the people who have followed this case from the very beginning, who have watched the press conferences and read the investigative threads and stayed awake at night turning the timeline over in their minds, that moment will not bring relief. It will bring grief. Because the confirmation of what many have suspected all along means that an 84-year-old woman who simply said no paid an unthinkable price for that word. It means the people she trusted most were the people she should have feared. And it means the dining table where she shared her last normal evening was not the safe place she believed it to be. This story is not over. Not by a long way. Not even close. If you believe Nancy deserves justice, share this video. If you have followed this case from the beginning and something here changed the way you see it, leave a comment and tell me what it was. And if you are new to this case and you want to understand every layer of what has been reported, subscribe, because the next update in this investigation will matter, and you will want to be here when it breaks. The case of Nancy Guthrie is still open and unresolved. The questions are still unanswered. And somewhere in the forensic labs and sealed courtrooms and digital archives of this investigation, the truth is still being assembled, one piece of evidence at a time.